Building upon the previous lessons that examined valid contract requirements and the essential elements of enforceability, we now focus on one of the most fundamental components of any binding real estate agreement: consideration. Consideration is what gives a contract its legal weight. Without it, even the most carefully written document cannot be enforced under Arizona law. It represents the mutual exchange of value that transforms a promise into a legally binding obligation. In real estate, consideration often takes the form of money, but it can also include promises, services, or forbearance. The Arizona courts and statutes have long emphasized that for a contract to be enforceable, there must be lawful and valuable consideration, meaning that each party must give or promise something of legal value in return for the other's performance. Consideration is defined as the benefit that each party receives or expects to receive when entering a contract. It can be a payment, a service, or even the promise to refrain from an action. The principle of consideration ensures fairness and mutuality by requiring both sides to assume an obligation. Under the common law principle reflected in Arizona's Statute of Frauds and reinforced by ARS. Paragraph 44-101, a real estate contract must be in writing and supported by valid consideration to be enforceable. For example, in a standard purchase contract, the buyer's consideration is typically the purchase price, while the seller's consideration is the transfer of title and ownership rights. Without this exchange, there is no binding agreement because a promise without something in return is merely a gift, not a contract. Earnest money, which is commonly included in real estate transactions, serves as a tangible example of consideration. It demonstrates the buyer's commitment to purchase and provides the seller with assurance that the buyer intends to perform. While earnest money is not legally required to form a valid contract, it often evidences good faith and supports the consideration already expressed through mutual promises. For instance, if a buyer offers $400,000 for a property and provides $10,000 in earnest money, both the offer and the money serve as consideration that binds the agreement once accepted. However, if no money is exchanged, but the buyer promises to pay the full price at closing and the seller agrees, the promise itself is still sufficient consideration under Arizona law. In Arizona, a contract must have consideration to be enforceable. A contract must have consideration because the law only enforces agreements where both parties exchange something of value, showing that they intend to be legally bound. Consideration distinguishes a true contract from a mere gift or casual promise by requiring each party to give or promise a benefit or incur a legal detriment. This mutual exchange provides objective evidence of seriousness, fairness, and enforceability, and it limits courts to resolving genuine legal obligations rather than personal or moral promises. The concept of valuable consideration extends beyond money and includes any benefit, right, or detriment bargained for between the parties. A seller might accept a buyer's agreement to assume an existing mortgage or to make repairs as part of the deal. These actions have measurable value and qualify as valid consideration. In contrast, a promise based on past conduct or moral obligation, such as a pledge to reward a friend for previous help, is not enforceable because it lacks present legal value. Arizona courts have consistently ruled that consideration must be current and not merely a reflection of gratitude or goodwill. An important distinction also exists between valuable and good consideration. Valuable consideration involves money, property, or services, something with measurable worth. Good consideration, on the other hand, refers to love, affection, or moral duty, which may have emotional significance but lacks legal enforceability. For example, if a parent transfers property to a child out of love, that is a gift, not a contract. If, however, the child agrees to provide lifetime care in exchange for the property, that reciprocal obligation creates valuable consideration, making the agreement enforceable. Consideration also plays a role in contract modifications. Any change to an existing real estate contract, such as an amendment to the purchase price, closing date, or repairs, must be supported by new consideration. This ensures that both parties receive value for their consent to altered terms. For example, if a seller agrees to extend the closing date by 30 days, the buyer might provide additional earnest money or agree to pay the seller's holding costs as consideration for that extension. Without new consideration, the modification may not be enforceable. A real-world example helps illustrate the principle. Suppose a buyer signs a contract to purchase a property for $500,000, and later the seller offers to reduce the price to $480,000 without any additional exchange of value. The seller's promise to reduce the price may not be enforceable because the buyer provided nothing new in return. However, if the buyer agrees to expedite closing or waive certain contingencies as part of the reduction, the contract modification now includes new consideration, making it binding. Courts in Arizona have historically reinforced the importance of consideration through case law. In Carruthers v. Underhill, Arizona 1953, the Arizona Supreme Court held that a contract lacking mutual exchange or detriment fails for want of consideration, even if both parties intended to perform. Similarly, in Hall v. World Savings and Loan Association, Arizona's APRs 2000, the court noted that consideration may consist of either a benefit to one party or a detriment to the other, as long as it forms the basis of a mutual obligation. These cases underline the necessity of balance and fairness in contractual exchanges and demonstrate how Arizona law views consideration as the essential glue holding contracts together. In the context of real estate agency, brokers must also understand consideration as it applies to employment and commission agreements. Under ARS, paragraph 32.2151.02, a broker's right to compensation must arise from a written employment agreement that specifies consideration in the form of services rendered. A broker who procures a ready, willing, and able buyer performs the consideration required by the contract and is entitled to the agreed-upon commission, even if the sale does not close due to the client's actions. Discussion. Why is consideration necessary for a real estate contract to be enforceable? Answer. Because consideration represents the exchange of value that transforms a promise into a legal obligation, ensuring that both parties receive a benefit or assume a detriment in the transaction. Can a contract modification be enforced without new consideration? Answer. No. Contract modifications require new consideration to ensure that each party gains something of value in exchange for agreeing to altered terms. Why does a promise based solely on moral obligation not constitute valid consideration? Answer. Because moral or emotional motives lack measurable legal value and do not represent a bargained-for exchange between the parties. Review summary. Consideration is the lifeblood of every valid and enforceable contract in Arizona real estate. It ensures mutuality and fairness by requiring each party to give or promise something of legal value in return for the other's performance. Valuable consideration typically involves money, property, or services, while promises grounded in moral duty or past actions do not meet the legal standard. Earnest money, mutual promises, or the assumption of obligations all serve as examples of valid consideration that make a real estate contract binding. Modifications to existing agreements must also be supported by new consideration to remain enforceable. Through both statutory provisions and case law, Arizona has made it clear that consideration is what distinguishes a binding contract from a mere promise or gift, ensuring integrity, reciprocity, and accountability in every real estate transaction.